Okay, we're now starting the fourth and last video for our Spring Break of 2017. Picking up with Don't Ask, Don't Tell for Clinton. In 1994, Bill Clinton made a major change to homosexuals serving in the military, the first major change since World War II when homosexuals were banned in serving in the military. He wanted to have them openly serve, but he had to compromise with Congress as a result. So the policy was don't ask, don't tell. You could be homosexual and serve in the military as long as you don't tell anybody, and if anybody try to ask you about it, they'd be the one punished, not you. Which is a major shift. Now, it didn't make homosexuals completely happy. In fact, you had, by 2008, over 12,000 homosexuals discharged from the military for refusing to be quiet about their sexuality. But it was, regardless, an important step forward for the rights of homosexuals. And in 2011, this act has been repealed, and now homosexuals, as of now, can serve openly. In fact, even transgender can serve in the military openly with no problem. So we're going to Clinton's second term and some other issues to deal with under the Clinton in the 90s. His second term matters. Long peacetime prosperity developed in his second term due to things like technology innovations in computers, the internet, and wireless communications. Online commerce, like online trading, also developed in the late 90s under Clinton too. The stock market began to rise. Unemployment went down from 7% in 92 down to about 4% in 2000. Average and lower income Americans also saw the first real gains since the 1970s in their income. This was also some of the lowest unemployment records for African Americans and Latinos in American history. So in general, we were doing pretty well in the late 90s. But a recession does hit in 2001, ending a lot of these gains. Most of his second term saw the U.S. with a surplus budget, but Clinton and Republican Congress fought on how to use it, and they couldn't always decide what to do best with that surplus. But in spite of all that, the economy did really well in those 4 years, and we had a lot of good prosperity, and like I said, the surplus and not deficit spending finally after decades of doing so. So we're going to look at the major issue that took up most of his second term, which is impeachment. Clinton was under investigation for a few different things throughout his presidency, mostly his issue, the Whitewater scandal back whenever he was governor of Arkansas, which basically was this misuse of funds when he was governor, but you don't have to worry about that. The issue that he gets impeached over is not having sex with somebody else. He did not committing adultery. It's not illegal to commit adultery. What's illegal is lying about it under oath, which is what he does, and which that's what he gets impeached for, is lying under oath and not actual infidelity. So anyway, there was a civil suit against him while he was president over sexual harassment by this lady named Paula Jones, who worked for him back when he was governor. Through a grapevine, she basically found out this former intern who worked for Clinton in the White House, Monica Lewinsky, had relations with him while in the White House. So another friend of hers basically tape recorded her without her knowledge while they had lunch one time, and she confessed to having sex and relations with Bill Clinton, which basically they're going to use this against him in the court hearings. Well, while in court for some of the various reasons why he was in court for some of these other scandals, Clinton denied under oath having any kind of sexual relations with that woman, as he said. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, as he said. So one of the special prosecutors who was involved in one of these investigations, a guy named Kenneth Starr, decided to basically prosecute Clinton for perjury. And so in 1998, in December, the House of Representatives, run by Republicans, voted for impeachment charges on perjury and obstruction of justice. So he was impeached by the House of Representatives officially, as you can see by this paper up here, but it was up to the Senate to decide whether or not to uphold those charges and to dismiss him, which they did not. There wasn't enough momentum to feel like this was necessary, so he was not removed from office as a result. But it did basically make him a lame duck and not able to do a whole lot else in the rest of his term as a result, and the scandals marred the rest of his presidency as a result too. In terms of foreign policy, this kind of covers all 8 years. In the post-Cold War era, the U.S. began more peacekeeping missions, trying to basically intervene in areas and try to maintain peace in different regions. We sent troops to Somalia in 93 in a civil war situation. We sent 20,000 troops to Haiti in 94 in another civil war type situation. The U.S. also helped in a conflict with the British and North Ireland people in 1998 for a lot of decades ongoing religious conflicts they had there. We also sent in troops to help out in Eastern Europe. Serbian dictators Slobodan Milosevic, you don't have to write that down, had suppressed a lot of independence movements in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans. Hundreds of thousands were killed in what was ethnic cleansing. NATO countries and the United States intervened in Bosnia in 95 and Kosovo in 99 to help stop the bloodshed. So there was some minor intervention here under Clinton in Bosnia and Kosovo as a result too. But that's mostly what you see for foreign policy when it comes to Clinton, is peacekeeping missions and trying to basically maintain these unstable regions like in East Europe. And why are there unstableness now in East Europe? Because there's no more Cold War. There's no more Soviets there basically watching these guys. And so a lot more instability as a result in these areas. Eventually that dictator Milosevic was overthrown and tried for genocide and eventually killed. This is all, the 90s is also when you see the rise of globalism, which is not directly involved with Clinton, but just you see more globalism in general. An increase of trade, communications, movement of capital around the world were all key parts of globalization. It promoted developments of global and regional economic organizations. Like the World Trade Organization was made in 94 to oversee trade agreements, enforce trade rules, and settle disputes amongst various countries across the globe. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank made loans to poor nations who had debt troubles. The European Union formed in the late 90s with 15 nations and developed a single currency, the euro, to eventually make a superpower type country. The G7 organization remained the world's leading economic powers, which involved the US, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK, which those countries control 2/3 of the world's wealth, and those countries still meet annually. But you have countries like Russia, China, Brazil, and India enjoying rapid development economically in that same time period. Workers and unions in these industrialized countries like our countries resented globalization. That's been one of the big things that Trump made his campaign on, is going anti-globalization and promoting more workers and unions and so on, because these guys lose their jobs to cheaper labor outsourcing and cross markets across the globe, which that's still an ongoing issue right now. But there's a big movement against globalization now with things like Brexit and Trump's election win and other countries doing some similar things to what we're doing. And for globalization, I wouldn't worry too much about knowing a lot of detail, but you just need to know in general what's happening with globalization and how it's becoming a bigger thing now. You have some major acts of terrorism happening under Clinton, which are leading towards 9/11. The first of which is the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. In February, Islamic terrorists set off a car bomb in the World Trade Center towers, the Twin Towers, in a lower level garage. It killed 6 people, and it injured about 1,000 more. These bombers were Islamic militias who were tired of American intervention in the Middle East, and they did have connections to the future 9/11 bombers about 10 years later. Then you had the biggest terrorist attack on American soil at the time, the Oklahoma City bombing. This was actually done by an American who was a militant anti-government activist named Timothy McVeigh, who detonated a massive car bomb next to a federal building in Oklahoma City. You can see a picture of the building here after it was destroyed. Here's a picture of the World Trade Center basement. This is a picture of the Oklahoma City bombing. About 168 people were killed, including men, women, and children, because they did run a daycare center there. He was crazy, and he hoped to spark a anti-government militant movement revolution take place in America, but that just didn't work out. He eventually was caught and convicted and executed in 2001. His accomplices, Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier, also got prison sentences as well. And in 2000, a U.S. Navy ship, the USS Cole, was bombed off the coast of Yemen while docked there. It was a suicide bombing with these they thought they were fishermen. They came up alongside the boat and blew themselves up. It killed 17 sailors on board and injured 39 other military members on the ship. and these guys did have links to Al-Qaeda. So you see the World Trade Center bombings and the USS Cole bombing did have links to Islamic terrorism and Al-Qaeda, which are going to be a problem for us, of course, in the next year in 2001. But you also see another massive terrorist attack, which terrorism becomes much more of a concern with us in the 90s with the Oklahoma City bombing as well. And lastly, you have changing American society. In the 1990s, the fastest growing regions in the U.S. continue to be the West and the South. That's a big thing that the AP test wants us to push, is the fact that the biggest growing regions in the 80s and 90s are the West and the South. South was the most populous with over 1 million people living there now, and the West enjoyed this shift of congressional representation and more electoral votes their way, especially places like Washington and California. It makes the South and the West much bigger political powers than they used to be a long time ago, and that's been a recent development in the last 20, 30 years. In 2000, 80% of Americans lived in over 280 metro areas, so most Americans now live in cities or around cities in the suburbs. The white-only population declined, although they stay the most dominant racial group in America. They go from 87% in 1970 down to about 75% by 2000. That's mostly due to lower birth rates and shifts in immigration, because most immigration before this came from Europe, and now they come from areas like Latin America, which is why you see a decrease in white population percentages. African American percentage rose to 12% by 2000, but Hispanics have surpassed them as the biggest minority in 2000 with 13% population, and they're continuing to grow. Asians also saw 10 million immigration in this time period and rapidly keep growing. Immigration accounted for about 28% increase of population in the 1990s and key in our economic growth, and which were key because of our labor force. A lot of these Asians and Latinos who came here during this time period were key to taking jobs and making our job growth and economic prosperity possible in the late 90s. So they are very much key, because if we didn't have this, basically we'd have a negative growth by 2020s, 2030s if we didn't have this population increase in this time period. By 2000, there was more concern now for people over 65 because the baby boom generation was finally getting older now, for issues like healthcare, drugs, senior housing, Social Security. There's been a decline of traditional marriage and a rise of single-parent households. Back in the 1970s, there was about 10% of the population which was headed by female solo parents, and now by 2000, it's about 17-18% households headed by a single female. Much greater amongst the African American community, with about 47% rate. This led to a poverty lifestyle for most of these children too. So if you're caught up in a single mom household, the children end up in a poverty state as a result down the road. The U.S. entered 2000 as the richest country in the world, but with the largest gap between the highest paid workers and lowest paid workers. Basically, there's a big wealth gap, even though we're the wealthiest country in the world by 2000. The top 20% saw their income increase the most since the 70s, but the other 80% saw income decrease since the 1970s. Numbers based on race, whites made on average about $53,000 a year in 2000, whereas minorities, Latinos, made about $35,000 a year, and African Americans made about $34,000 a year by 2000. High school grads also made about half of what college grads made in general. So I know there's a lot of numbers to think about. Don't worry about the numbers, but they do want you to kind of know the trends about how populations are shifting, how that affects politics. They want you to be aware of how traditional marriage is not as big a factor anymore. They want you to be aware of what type of immigrants we're getting more numbers of now, with more Latinos, more Asians now in this time period, and how we're still very prosperous, but we do have a bigger wealth gap in general. So these are all things to kind of keep in mind. So we're going to stop there over the break. We're going to return back after the break and deal with George W. Bush and 9/11 and all that when we return to school. Have a good holiday.